Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Empty Cloud Buddhist Monastery for our Thursday evening Dhamma program. I am Bhikkhu Santi. Very happy to have you with us this evening. We'll be meditating together for about half an hour, and then I'll be sharing some Dhamma reflections. We'll start right off with the meditation period now. Please find your way into a comfortable seated posture. An upright posture is going to be best this evening. Sitting in a chair, or sitting on the floor, as you prefer, but with the back straight, not rigid, but comfortably upright. A wakeful position is what we are aiming for. As you find your way into your seat, you can start off by letting the eyes gently close and taking a few deep breaths, just letting it all go. Reflecting maybe that during this day, this period of wakefulness, whether it's 16 hours, 17 hours, you've got that many half-hour periods, 32, 34, and you can commit one of them, this 30 minutes, just to this meditation. Probably during this 30 minutes, many thoughts will come to mind that seem quite worthy of thinking, and maybe even are in their own terms, but they'll come back if they need to. For this 30 minutes, let's make the determination of presence, and any thoughts that arise, any images, any distractions from presence, we'll simply regard as phenomena to be investigated. Just inner things to know, to notice for what they are. So coming into presence, we'll begin with a body scan, as we did yesterday. I'll simply name part of the body and invite you simply to know that part of the body, to notice what awareness, what sensations, what feelings are there in that part of the body, and nothing else. Not to do anything to that part of the body, not to judge anything about your experience of that part of the body, just to know it, know what is there in the immediate present moment, sensation, feeling of that part of the body. So beginning the body scan, I'm just going to name body parts and invite you to just direct your attention to that part of the body. The top of the head. The back of the head. The sides of the head. The ears. The forehead. The temples. The eyes. nose, mouth, cheeks, chin, and the whole face, and the whole head. And the neck, front and back. The shoulders, both shoulders. The shoulder blades. The upper arms, front and back. The elbows, front and back. The forearms, front and back. The backs of the hands. Front of the hands. Fingers. Fingertips. The entire arms, both arms, simply feeling the arms. And the shoulder blades. The upper chest. The mid chest. The belly. The chest cavity and the belly. Feel the interior of the trunk. And the bottom of the belly. The pelvis. And the back, from the back of the neck at the top of the spine. The whole upper back. The mid back. The mid spine. The lower back. the small of the back. The seat where it contacts the ground, the mat, the chair. The underside of the upper legs and the front of the upper legs. The upper legs just above the knee, front and back. The knees, front and back, both knees. Lower legs, front and back. Calves and shin. The ankles. The tops of the feet. The heels of the feet. The arches and soles, both feet. And the toes, both feet. And feel the entire legs, both legs. Feel the entire body, trunk, the arms, the head. Noticing the feeling of the breath. Just noticing. The feeling of the breath and the space between the breath. Wherever your awareness registers the movement of the breath, it might be broad, it might be narrow. Natural breath. For the rest of the meditation period, I invite you to practice this natural breath, just letting the breath guide itself, involuntary unforced, undirected breath, simply noticing whatever sensations are present. If there are blank areas, noticing that. If there is wandering of the mind, noticing that. If there's judgment of the wandering mind, a desire for the mind to be acting differently, notice that. And when the noticing comes in, turn back to the breath. Let's stay with the breath, but I'd like to invite a subtle shift for the final part of the meditation. In the instructions I offered, you might have noticed a subtle goal orientation, not an invitation to any judgment, but there was a subtle goal of staying with the breath to encourage settling of the mind, the cultivation of calm. We'll continue to stay with the breath, but I invite you to shift from a goal orientation to a source orientation. To let go of the idea of doing anything to the mind or anything to the breath, and instead inquire, investigate at the level of feeling whatever comes in. The mind is settled, but in the next 7 or 8 minutes, perhaps some image may arise or some thought. Notice. Notice it for what it is. An image. A thought. And watch it. Investigate it as a thought, as an image. And notice what happens. Notice where it goes. You can ask the question, what does this thought want? What does this image want? Watch until it fades, and then come back to the breath. Stay with the breath. If nothing comes in, stay with the breath. If a thought arises, investigate. Just take your time coming out of meditation. Let the breath slowly re-engage. Maybe take some deeper breaths. When you feel ready, you can open your eyes. We'll take a minute or two before I start offering some Dhamma reflections to stretch, move, shift your position. Find a position you'll be comfortable in for the more active part of the Dhamma program. While you're resettling, I'd like to offer a footnote. That distinction between goal-oriented and source-oriented meditation, one that I found helpful, is from Ajahn Munindo, one of the elders of the Thai forest tradition, where I have done most of my training so far as a monk. Ajahn Munindo was a disciple of several of the Thai forest masters. Ajahn Tate was his main teacher, I believe. And he's now an abbot of a monastery in England. It's quite a beautiful, helpful distinction between goal-oriented and source-oriented. And I may come back to it at one point tonight. And if you found your way into a comfortable position, let me re-extend my welcome, my greetings to everyone this evening. I know probably some of you have just tuned in. I'm Bhante Santi, a visiting monk from the Temple Forest Monastery in New Hampshire. Very happy to be spending some months at Empty Cloud. Welcome to Ron and Denise, Reed, How's our friend, Gita, and a pretty big group of people, and as yet unannounced. Welcome. We'll begin with an homage to the Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. Well, the title of my talk, as announced, is a shortened version, Investigating the Dhamma. The original title was Principles for Investigating the Dhamma. I'm glad it got shortened. Principles sounds a little kind of lofty, and what I was going to offer and will offer by way of the kind of content is more, rather than principles, I'll just say rules of thumb or tips for approaching the Dhamma. I offer no particular authority to support the tips I'm going to offer other than just my own experience. I offer the tips I'm going to offer in the spirit of skillful means, ideas. Maybe I'll even hold off on claiming skillful. Ideas that you may find skillful or unskillful. Maybe you can make them your own in some way, or maybe, I offer them as food for thought, and tools for investigation. I am glad, though, either way, not just for that reason, that the title of the talk got shortened, because I realized just a little while ago that investigating the Dhamma is a Pali concept that I'm actually going to be talking about later. I hadn't even quite made the connection to the Pali term. Some of you may know, Dhamma Vichaya. It means maybe more directly, or more accurately, investigation of Dhamma, investigation of Dhammas, plural perhaps. Dhamma Vichaya, investigation of Dhammas, is one of the Bojjhangas, the factors of enlightenment. If you haven't heard of this, it is a list. It's one of the important Buddhist lists that come down to us as a kind of schematic guide or map for our Dhamma practice. It's one of the 37 wings of awakening, the Pakya Dhammas. And so one of the principal lists, there's 7 factors that help us to cultivate our minds towards enlightenment. And in many, many places in the Buddha's teachings, we are told that when these factors are brought to fulfillment, they result in the fruition of awakening. Many of the 7 factors of enlightenment I'll just mention. It's a very nice list to have in the back of our minds as we're thinking about the Dhamma. Are sati, mindfulness, Dhamma vichaya, investigation of Dhammas, or to translate it the way it usually is, investigation of states, virya, energy, piti, rapture or joy, passaddhi, tranquility, samadhi, collectedness of mind, unification of mind, and upekkha, equanimity. You may have heard Dhamma reflections on many of those, but if there are gaps, if there are factors in that list that you have not paid attention to or had a lot of input on, I bet Dhamma vichaya is one of them. It's not talked about quite as often, and I find, to my delight, it is the theme of my talk this evening. So to get at it, let's start off by defining our terms. Often a good thing to do at the beginning of a discussion that touches on immaterial things, abstract things. Dhamma is a term that I like to come back to often, to redefine often. It's easy to slip into fixed set categories, but one of the beautiful qualities of the Pali language, in which the teachings have been preserved, and from which so many different expressions, the teaching has found so many different expressions in so many cultures, in so many languages. But in the Pali language, where it was first set down and as it's come down to us, words tend to cover a bigger, broader circle of meaning than they do in many other languages, including English. Where you might find one word in Pali, you'll find 8 or 10 different words in English. Often is the case. Interestingly, I think I'll leave it at that on that point. But the word Dhamma has a number of different meanings that are frequently used. We just encountered a very important usage. Dhamma referring to states of mind or contents of mind more generally. It sometimes is used specifically to refer to states of mind, but in this sense, it can refer to any mental phenomenon, a thought, an image, an idea, or more broadly, a state being like a condition of mind, a level of mind, of subjective framework, of mood, can be a state of mind. Of course, we can sometimes find our way into jargon, and even with these English terms, typically in Dhamma circles, when we say state of mind, we're not including a thought. I think it's a helpful distinction. In everyday English, sometimes people will include thoughts in states. Certainly in like philosophy, a state of mind could be a thought. But in Dhamma circles, we think more of a state as a general condition, a level or condition of mind. And we think of thoughts as crystallizations of states. Thoughts can steer or shape states, and often out of states, a particular quality of mind will come in. For example, if you're in a state of contraction, and for example, if you're angry, thoughts will come in of anger. If you're in a place of peace, well, often thoughts of Dhamma will come in for me. In general, thoughts of peace will come in. So that's one important use of Dhamma. But The one that probably first leaps to mind when you hear the word Dhamma is the teachings of the Buddha. And of course, that is a principal use of it. We often see it in English with a capital letter, Dhamma, capital D. There are no capitals in Pali, but we capitalize it to make clear which meaning is meant in some contexts. And sometimes that's unfortunate because sometimes the other associations can be helpful. But even with that one definition, it's important to keep in mind two senses of Dhamma as the Buddha's teaching. One sense is the Dhamma is the suttas, the recorded writings that preserve the Buddha's teachings. And people use Dhamma to mean that all the time. But it also means the teachings as the Buddha originally taught them. Are those the same thing? Well, I'm going to talk about that in a moment. Actually, I'll talk about it right now. The first of the, and I won't try to be super organized here. I'm going to start off with the first of the tips that I want to offer you tonight. The first of the rules of thumb, and it's this. Anything can be handled skillfully or unskillfully, including the Dhamma. That extra including the Dhamma is a second part of the tip. Let's pause on the first part of the tip. Anything can be handled skillfully or unskillfully. This is a really important point for me to keep in mind, that skillful and unskillful, wholesome and unwholesome, good and bad, are not properties of external things. There are no objects or ideas which are in themselves good or bad. It's the agent, the one who holds them or uses them or handles them, who invests them with goodness or badness. I'm referring here to the term kusala or akusala, which you may know from Pali. Another of these words that has several meanings. Typically, it has some kind of moral flavor, like good or bad, but it also means skillful or unskillful. And this is a really interesting difference between, it's interesting to have those concepts blended together. So moving to the second point, that even the most beautiful thing, the thing that we revere the most, the thing that offers us deliverance from all of our suffering, the Dhamma, it can actually be handled unskillfully. It can be made into something static that can be imposed on, by which we can impose something which is not Dhamma, something which is not actually in accordance with the underlying truth that the Dhamma points to. So there, I'm getting into something that sounds a little bit maybe koan-like, a little bit esoteric, that the Dhamma is not necessarily the Dhamma. Well, here I want to bring in this distinction I was drawing between the teachings of the Buddha and what has been recorded. The teachings that have been recorded are all recorded as being secondhand teachings. Every sutta in the Sutta Pitaka, the collection of more story-like suttas, begins, "Thus have I heard the Buddha to say," or the great disciples to say. So it's all secondhand. At the same time, it comes from very, very early in the history of the Sangha and has been preserved in traditions of great reverence. So it's not that it's like a game of telephone wire, or I guess in England they call it Chinese whispers, where the original meaning has been lost. It's not that at all. The teachings of the Pali Canon, for the most part, come from very early in the history of the Sangha, but they are not synonymous with the Buddha's words necessarily. it's uncertain. That'll bring me very shortly to my second point. But before we leave the idea of the Dhamma, I want to bring to mind a third meaning of Dhamma related to this idea of the Dhamma as the Buddha's teachings. There's the Buddha's teachings as they were originally said. There's the recorded version, which we sometimes call Dhamma. And then there is the truth that they point to, the nature of things. Nature of things is also a translation of Dhamma to bear in mind. Okay, so that brings me to my second point. First one again was anything can be handled skillfully or unskillfully. The second is the Dhamma provides the tools for understanding the Dhamma. I'll say it one more time. The Dhamma provides the tools for understanding the Dhamma. And I just offered an example of that by mentioning that, well, there's some uncertainty about exactly how the Buddha may have put a particular teaching, or how it may have changed in the course of the transmission of the teachings in oral form over the first 200 to 400 years before they were recorded, and then the transmission of the written suttas over the next 2,100 to 2,300 years of Buddhist history. So that uncertainty is itself described in the Dhamma. It's one of the principal marks of existence in the Buddha's teaching. I'm referring to the teachings of anicca, anatta, and dukkha, usually translated impermanence, not self, and suffering. Each of these marks has its feeling component. Impermanence gives rise to the feelings of insecurity and uncertainty that make our existence not entirely satisfactory in every way, that make it dukkha. Maybe I'll leave it at that. There's the first example of how the Dhamma provides the tools for understanding the Dhamma. At the same time, this recognition that there's uncertainty provides us with a tremendously empowering both opportunity and responsibility of interpreting. We, in order to practice the Dhamma, I would argue, must interpret the Dhamma. We need to judge what is Dhamma and what is adhamma, what is not Dhamma. There are suttas that talk about the inevitability of the decline of the Dhamma. The Buddha put a timeline on the Buddha is written to have put a timeline on the life of the dispensation of his teaching of Buddhism. And the timeline, the clock is ticking as in accordance with anicca, with impermanence. All conditioned things are impermanent, is one of our central teachings. And the Dhamma is a conditioned thing in its manifestation as a set of ideas, a set of teachings. So I say that this is an opportunity because it allows us to through our wise discernment, get at what is most skillful, most helpful, and most true in the writings that have come down to us. It lets us make choices that get at the heart of the Dhamma. And this brings me to my third tip of the evening, which has to do with the underlying unity of the Dhamma. My sense is that the story might go something like this, that after the Buddha's parinibbana, his disciples, who by that time were many, carried on their practice of Dhamma in different regions and developed slightly different understandings, different flavors. And that over time, these became clearer and more distinct, so that we can often see slightly different treatments of similar Dhamma ideas between different suttas. Over time, if you've studied Buddhist history at all, you'll know that different schools arose in the first 500 years or so. The classic number given is 18 different schools of early Buddhism. But 18 was one of those numbers that actually represented a more general idea than the number 18. It really just means many schools arose in that era of what's come to be called sectarian Buddhism. And they had different ideas, which can make the teachings seem sometimes, confusing. The recognition of this historical process, to me, inspires the interpretive approach of looking for unities. Look for the underlying unities that you can find in the teachings, both the recorded teachings and your understanding of the underlying teachings. The unities are the parts that we can hold on to and commit ourselves to exploring deeply. The unities I'm thinking about, I'll give you a few examples. I started off by mentioning the Bojjhangas, the 7 factors of enlightenment, and I mentioned what they were. I'd like you to consider where those overlap with some other very important teachings that you may be familiar with. We can start with the teachings on right samadhi, right unification of mind. You may be familiar with the idea that when we get to the deepest stages of jhana, of meditation, there are peaceful states of mind that arise. The thread of there's a thread in the teachings that traces these in the form of what are called the 4 jhanas in English. I like the translation, actually, the 4 levels of jhana, because at root, the word jhana really just means meditation. And these are states that will arise, I would say, almost inevitably in meditation when meditation deepens to a certain point. Actually, all of the great modern teachers who teach on the jhana are pretty much in agreement that the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th jhana will arise on their own, that there's nothing you need to actually do to guide them once you have deepened into the level of the 1st jhana. In the description of those jhanas, we often are given the interpretation that they represent discrete states of mind, and that we can or maybe even should think of them as particular attainments, things to be gotten. That is a very, very common understanding, and to my mind, that contradicts the kind of underlying unity of the jhana descriptions with other teachings like the Bojjhangas. I'm thinking particularly how in each of the jhana levels, there is a characteristic state which is identical to the Bojjhangas, more or less. Not perfectly. They're different enough that you can read the texts and think, oh, these are 2 different things. They're sort of overlapping, but they're described really differently. I'm just going to put each one in its own category and not worry about what they have to do with each other. But to me, the overlap, the similarity, lets us kind of separate the wheat from the chaff and recognize the underlying unity. So in the 1st jhana, we notice that, there's a state, a factor of rapture that comes in. Oh, that's the 4th of the Bojjhangas. In the second of the jhana, in the second jhana, we have a characteristic state of tranquility of mind, sometimes called confidence of mind. Ajata, internal sampada. I might be getting that a little bit scrambled up, but internal tranquility, which is sharing the same root with the fifth of the bojjhangas, passaddhi, tranquility. And the culmination of the bojjhangas, equanimity, is the culmination, is the feeling aspect of the fourth of the jhanas. So noticing this and noticing how often when the bojjhangas are discussed, their fulfillment is described as fulfilling the factors of awakening, and noticing that the fulfillment of the jhana factors brings the meditator to the brink of the potential for full awakening. I have to conclude, okay, there's an underlying unity here. We're talking about the same thing. We also notice that those states come up in discussions of mindfulness in the Satipatthana Sutta. In fact, the bojjhangas are right near the end, right near the finale, if you will, of the fourth of the foundations of mindfulness, the mindfulness of dhammas, of mind objects, as it's sometimes translated. So there's one of the meanings we discussed coming back. The bojjhangas are given as objects of mindfulness that we can practice with in the context of satipatthana meditation, both as objects of mindfulness, things to notice, and as ways of developing mindfulness. In other words, these are dhammas, concepts or ideas, both to, in a sense, be our objects to think about, well, to contemplate on, but also to contemplate with. That's I think, a useful distinction too for that final of the Satipatthana meditations. There are things that we think about, and there are things that we think with. There are things that we contemplate as our contemplation topics, but there are also things which are modes of contemplation, which are for contemplation. The bojjhangas are a good example. Okay, well, I've got a couple more tips for you. I'm going to add on, beyond the Dhamma provides the tools for understanding the Dhamma. Anything can be handled skillfully and unskillfully. Look for the underlying unities of the Dhamma. The next tip is maybe a little bit more of a description of what I've been doing so far in my talk this evening, but it's something I'd like to share with you as a kind of tip because I think it can be quite fruitful. And that is, I sum it up, make the translation. Think about the translation from the concepts you're being given in Pali as Buddhist concepts, or being given in some sort of form of jargon in English. Make the translation to your ordinary terms, the concepts that you use in your modern life. And I'm using the term translation broadly to mean not just words, but also attitudes and concepts and thought styles. I'll just give you a few examples. We talked about one yesterday. We talked about the Pali idea of wise attention, given in Pali as yoniso manasikara. We considered it from the viewpoint of attention as we usually think about it in modern terms. We're often given as one of the great poles guiding stars, pole stars of Dhamma practice, the mental faculty of wisdom. Wisdom as a kind of almost jargony translation of the Pali concept of panya. What is wisdom, though, really? or its opposite, ignorance, avidya. As those are sometimes presented, they don't exactly line up with any of our modern categories. Not quite. Yesterday, I started off with the question in my Dhamma reflections of what is it that moves the mind, and I never quite got to the answer that I was given when I was starting out in my Dhamma practice, which I found quite helpful. But it has to do with what I'm talking about now. The answer that I was given was that, well, there's only two things that move the mind, that move us from one idea to another, one thought to another, one ambition or goal to another. And those two things are either wisdom or ignorance. The mind is moved by only those two things. And as someone just newly turned to the Dhamma path, I found that extremely inspiring and quite helpful. But I also didn't really understand it fully because I wasn't really sure what was meant by wisdom. I had this idea of something quite kind of mysterious. I'm gonna turn to Dhamma questions very soon, but I'm gonna allow one question to jump the line because it's very relevant. Gita just asked, well, Bhante, isn't wisdom seeing things truthfully as they really are? Yes, that is indeed what wisdom is. But is there a way to translate that into the wisdom that arises in the course of everyday life? I'll just throw out, and this can be part of your questions or our discussion together. I'll just throw out, well, I have the modern translation I've talked about before of creative, skillful intelligence. Wisdom is the application of intelligence. It is a mysterious faculty, and it is not self. But it is no different from the intelligence that we bring to bear on the problems of our lives, the questions of our lives, when it's skillful, when it's wholesome, when it is to our benefit and the benefit of others. And it's what brings us to see things truthfully as they really are. My last tip for the evening is one that overlaps with making the translation a little bit. It's not a tip that gets you to a final answer. It's more for a tip for getting started on your Dhamma Vichaya, your investigation of a particular aspect of Dhamma. And here I'm using the term Dhamma Vichaya a little more broadly, and I think that's a fair use of the term. Dhamma Vichaya can mean just investigation, our theme for the evening. And the last tip is look for the simplest and most straightforward explanation of seemingly mystifying concepts, no matter how much reverence even we may have for them, no matter how exalted, without diminishing those important aspects, those important feelings and qualities. Start your investigation where your common sense leads. And maybe as a final example, both to demonstrate that and to kind of connect to the tip about making the translation, I'd just like to offer a thought about the term and the concept of nibbana, the goal of the path, the thing that's leading us forward, that brought us here, that we're following the path for. What is it? I bet you spend time thinking about that, contemplating that. What am I doing this for? What could it be? It sounds so wonderful, the ultimate state. So in my contemplation of that, I had this really simple realization that has helped me. It doesn't take me to the final answer, but it's kind of it's given me an orientation that I can work with. It followed just from the reflection that the way that dukkha is usually translated, the thing that we're trying to end, suffering, doesn't capture the full range of what counts as dukkha. I should back up just a little bit to make sure we're all on the same page that nibbana, the end of the path, is synonymous with the end of dukkha, or liberation from suffering. That's how the Buddha describes it again and again and again. And what can that actually mean, the liberation from suffering? Well, I recalled that in many, many modern translations and down throughout Buddhist history, dukkha has been understood to cover the full range from severe pain, from suffering, from lamentation and grief, all the way down to just simple dissatisfaction, things being unsatisfactory. In the same way that often even just a subtle uncertainty, a sense of mild insecurity about things, that's dukkha. In fact, that's the essence of dukkha. So if we go with the translation of dissatisfaction, unsatisfactory, just for the entire category of dukkha, I ask myself, what is the opposite? If the opposite of nibbana is unsatisfactory, then nibbana is satisfactory, right? It's when things are satisfactory. And thinking about that, I thought, well, okay, what does that actually mean? And I connected it to the idea of contentment. Contentment is more of it's not a positive quality of like joy. It's when you feel like, enough, okay, you're satisfied. That's what satisfaction is. You're satisfied, you're content. Now, maybe that doesn't sound exalted or lofty enough, but I'd like you just to imagine, here for the end of our talk, imagine a moment of contentment. It probably started with relief, like, okay, I finally got this thing that I wanted, or I finally let go of this thing that I didn't want. Just that first moment of relief followed by that next moment of contentment. So when we're unenlightened, of course, then immediately it starts to fall apart. You're content for a short time, and then some new dissatisfaction comes in. But what would it be like if you bring to mind that moment of contentment? Can you imagine that the contentment just continued, that it continued on and on and on, and that it never ended? What if being satisfied, feeling like things were sufficient, that it was enough, that things were really absolutely fine, never ended? To me, it's actually impossible to imagine that. That would be absolutely satisfactory. That would be wonderful. So I don't find that to be an idea that diminishes my conception of nibbana. I find it gives me something to work towards. The Buddha actually praised contentment, and I'm not sure exactly which sutta it was, but spoke of making much of contentment. That's how it's often translated. And to me, it's good advice. Contentment is on the spectrum that maybe starts with relief and proceeds to peace. Well, I offer those words for your reflection, and hope that you find some of those ideas helpful. And maybe we can turn now to our online audience for any questions that may have come up, or comments or reflections. You can feel free to type them in. There's quite a few. I'll start working down the list, and also invite our resident community who are here tonight with me in the room. If you have any questions, you can think about them. Okay, turning to the live chat. Let's see what questions we have this evening, or comments. Nice big group of friends are here. Gita is taking joy in the 7 factors of enlightenment. Wonderful. And Gita says, Bhante, does wisdom help us to guard our sense faculties as they meet consciousness just prior to engaging in volitional action? Oh, very well. Let's change that into a comment. So, wisdom helps us to guard our sense faculties as they meet consciousness just prior to engaging in volitional action. Yes, indeed. And that's a great way to think about it. If you were with us last night, you would have heard some discussion of guarding the sense doors, I think is how it's usually framed. Noticing the arising of a potentially uh, a potential snare, a sense impression that's going to draw you in and cause you to lose your heedfulness. I gave the example of passing a bakery and smelling the delicious smell of fresh baked bread coming out. If you're guarding your sense faculties, you might notice that. And before turning your head and taking in the deliciousness of the aroma and the possibility of going to the store and getting lost in that whole train of thought and having that become your new reality, you see what's happening and you make a decision. My body needs food. Yes, this is wholesome. This is good. I'm going to go with this. Or, no, I just had breakfast. I'm going to keep going about my day and do something useful. It's wisdom that recognizes that. Yes, Geeta, I think you put it very, very well. And it's ignorance in both the English sense and the Pali sense that goes after the object and brings in the sense of self to make you into the bread version of the Cookie Monster, basically. Okay, next question would be Ron asking, could you say more about thinking about versus thinking with? Sure, this is a distinction that I learned from a scholar, actually, a scholar of an academic subject, but that I found to be really useful in Dhamma practice as well. It helped me to understand the last of the four foundations in a kind of a way that was more helpful for me than when I didn't understand it. Thinking about and thinking with has to do with our conceptual frames for investigating the world. For example, the person I learned this from was a professor of anthropology. A conceptual frame in anthropology might be kinship relations, thinking about how the way that families are structured and the way that different roles in clan groups, family groups, extended family groups work changes the shape and feeling of a culture. So anthropologists have this idea. It's an idea that they use to analyze cultures. They do use it to analyze family groupings in cultures to understand, well, in this culture, second cousins can't get married, or grandfathers cannot be alone with their granddaughters. So that might be an example of thinking about the topic of kinship relations. But it also might be the case that kinship relations shed light on how food is produced in a given culture, or how people give gifts. Those are different topics. But thinking in terms of kinship relations would be an example of thinking with. So we think with the idea, not necessarily about that, not necessarily about the topic. In thinking about the fourth foundation of mindfulness, this is helpful, I think, substituting the word contemplate for thinking. What we get in the fourth foundation of mindfulness is a sequence of dhammas, ideas, that are just listed. We're not really told exactly what to do with them. I think the sequence goes something like this. First, we get the hindrances as the first of the five objects. The first of the chitta nupasi objects. So we're told we should be mindful of the five hindrances. greed, desire, aversion, restlessness and agitation, sloth and torpor, and doubt. So what do we do with those? Are we supposed to try to understand what they are by thinking about them? Or are we simply supposed to notice when they arise? In my opinion, it's a little bit of both, mainly the second one. We're thinking with the categories of the 5 hindrances to notice their arising. It's not that a little light goes off and I see desire. It's some particular desire. It's like, oh, I remember that delicious bread. It might come up during meditation. And instead of fantasizing about the bread, I see it as a particular feeling of desire. That would be thinking with or contemplating with that particular hindrance. And it gets more inspiring if we continue with the contemplation objects that are both for contemplating with and contemplating about. If you might want to reread the 4th part of the Satipatthanas. It goes on from the hindrances to the khandhas, the 5 khandhas that make up our experience, or the alternative breakdown of our experience that the Buddha gives us, the 6 ayatanas, the sense bases. From there, I think we go right to the bojjhangas. So we're closing the circle on the Dhamma talk a little bit this evening. The bojjhangas are a beautiful example of concepts that we can both contemplate with and about. You notice when concentration settles to a certain point that a kind of gladness comes into the body. And you know you're at the edge. When the mind is quiet and thoughts take on a kind of whispery quality, and there are long gaps between them sometimes, you know you're kind of at the edge of something really beautiful arising in the body. And with that map of the bojjhangas, you have a name for it. Okay, maybe that's the edge of piti, of rapture coming in. That's the contemplating with. And when it arises, you're mindful of it. And that is the contemplating on. So there's an example for you. I hope that's helpful. Let's see if we have any more questions here. Is everything, here's a great question. I'm delighted to have it. Cows Our Friend asks, is everything experienced a Dhamma? In the 4 frames of reference, does the 4th frame fully encompass the first 3? Is everything we experience a Dhamma? Yeah, that's one of the meanings of Dhamma. Everything that we experience is a Dhamma. The teachings are beautifully interlocked and interdependent in this way. In that sense that you're pointing to, Cows Our Friend, yeah, the first 3 would certainly be encompassed by the 4th in that sense. Mind is the forerunner of all things, as the Dhammapada teaches us. But translation, the word there, things, is Dhamma. It's not like the things of reality. It's the things of our experience. Is there a difference between those? Not really an explicit topic in the Pali Canon. Many modern commentators will say the Buddha was a phenomenologist. The Buddha only talked about experience. I actually think it's not so clear. I think the distinction just wasn't always that clearly drawn. But the topic of our cultivation is our experience. So in that sense, we're talking about not things in some final, ultimate ontological reality, but our experience, things as we experience them. Okay, Gonzalo Pardo, welcome. Dear Santi, what would you recommend? Dear Santi, what would you recommend if one does not agree with something about Dhamma? I'm asking as someone interested in meditation, but who is not a Buddhist. Thanks a lot. Really like your reflections. Oh, thank you for those nice final comments. Well, I think the first thing to inquire is like, you need to articulate for yourself, what is it? I mean, in a sense, you can't really have something that doesn't agree with Dhamma I mean, this is a little bit of a koan like way of putting it. There is Dhamma in the sense of recorded writings, which most Buddhists who I know, many Buddhists who I know, do not agree with. We call it Dhamma. The classic example is the Garu Dhammas. There's a verse in the Anguttara Nikaya, a sutta in the Anguttara Nikaya, which lays out a set of restrictions on the behavior and comportment of bhikkhunis, of women monastics, which is, to many modern practitioners, we just can't really accept that it's the Dhamma. And by taking the anicca view of the formation of the suttas that I've been pointing to, we can see clear evidence that, this really looks like a later addition, and in some sense it's a corruption. The text of this actual sutta contains like noticeable deviations in style from most of the suttas. There's a kind of significant continuity error where Ananda seems to be the wrong age relative to the chronology that the sutta points to. And there's good reason, if you are willing to take a historical view of the formation of the suttas, to say, those Garu Dhammas, that Dhamma is not Dhamma. So in that sense, if there's something you disagree with, it might not be Dhamma in that sense, but there's another sense of Dhamma, which is Dhamma means, and it's used to mean the truth of things. So if something is true, you can't not agree with it. That's the definition of irrational. The question is it being taught in a way that's skillful in the Buddhist circles that you're encountering, or in the formulations that you're encountering? And to me, that's not a problem. That's an opportunity for inquiring. What is the truth of this matter? Am I stuck in something, or is it being framed in a way that's unskillful? It's a chance to learn, to inquire more deeply into the matter. I'm glad this actually is a point I wanted to make in my reflections that you've given me the opportunity to come back to. In a sense, Dhamma Vichaya, Dhamma investigation, is not about finding answers. The answers that you come to are themselves only temporarily satisfactory. Like the matter that you're asking about, that you either agree with or disagree with, as it's been taught by some Buddhists that you've encountered, you can come to an answer for yourself that, okay, I've got an answer that Buddhism does or does not say this particular thing. But that answer is not the answer. This actually could be one of my tips. Answers are not the answer. No answer is going to actually satisfy you in the way that you're looking to be satisfied by walking the path in a permanent, fixed way. Answers, by their very nature, lead to more questions. Questions are closer. Questions carry you forward. And that openness of mind, the curiosity, which is one important translation, I think, of Dhamma Vichaya, one translation we can make, I think is really valuable. So if something doesn't agree with the Dhamma, then, well, that's not the Dhamma. Or maybe you need to look more closely at it. I'm glad you didn't tell me what the actual thing was, because then you can hear that suggestion without any judgment at all. I don't even know what the question is. Okay, I'm asking as someone interested in meditation, but who is not a Buddhist. Yeah, okay. I hope that's helpful. Any other questions? Have I missed anything? Yeah, I think that was it. And time's running a little low. Are there any questions from our resident community who's here with me this evening? Jens has a question.
I have a question, Tan. Can you speak more about the development or cultivation of contentment and being content, especially I think in the light of questioning, because traditionally we're taught, oh, we're questioning, we're not content with the answer. We're not content with what we have.
Yeah.
Why are we questioning? Why are we asking?
Yeah, Jens is asking for any further reflections on, correct me if I paraphrase this, on cultivating contentment,
Right.
and relating the question to what he's discerning as a sort of characteristic lack of contentment in the state of questioning. We want an answer. There's a dissatisfaction at the heart of a question. I think that's very perceptive. But is it the full truth of the matter? Well, let's break the question down. So Dhamma Vichaya, the investigation of states, as it's usually translated, is, I think, traditionally often understood in a slightly narrower sense than I've been using it. It's contemplating on our broader mind states. In the Anupanasati instructions, we're encouraged, for example, in one of those later quatrains, to know a expanded mind as an expanded mind, to know a contracted mind as a contracted mind. I understand this to mean to know at the feeling level. That's Dhamma Vichaya, to be with that state and feel what it is, what's constituting it, what each of its elements are. And this would be the first part of my answer to your question about contentment, to notice moments of contentment and simply investigate them, feel into them by bringing mindfulness to them as to any wholesome state. You will not only have the nature of the state unfold to you, but you will deepen the state. That's right effort. Bringing mindfulness to a wholesome state is right effort. And as for the second part of your question, apply some Dhamma Vichaya to that sense of dissatisfaction that goes with the question. It's a really, really important feeling, that need, that dissatisfaction that makes you want to know. For example, like, here's the classic question: what is consciousness really? There's one that drives so many Dhamma practitioners forward. We feel like if we could just figure out that, and we only have 2 or 3 minutes left, so there's no way anybody can ask me, what is consciousness? But the question itself, that feeling of like wanting to know what it is, you feel like if I could just get that question answered, I'd be enlightened. I would have it all. And then you get an answer that temporarily seems to move you forward, and no, you're not enlightened. It just opens up more questions. Yeah, you want to investigate that. What if you can't understand it conceptually? Mm-hmm. Could you be okay with that? There's something to investigate. So there's some thoughts for you, if not answers, but I guess it wouldn't really be consistent to give you an answer. Okay, any other questions this evening? All right, well, we're just about out of time anyway, so why don't we end the evening with 3 sadhus, as is our tradition here, and I'll wish everyone a wonderful evening or morning, wherever you happen to be, or day. We'll be back tomorrow morning with monk chat. With our final sutta study of the week at 8 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, and in the evening, I believe we will have monk chat. It's on a schedule right now as a Dhamma talk, but I think that's a mistake. We're not entirely sure. But in any case, the program will begin as usual at 7:30 tomorrow evening. Okay, thank you very much. I wish you a wonderful rest of your day or evening. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.